The incident. Ben stood behind the counter of a bustling coffee shop, wiping down the stainless steel surface as he did after every rush. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee hung heavy in the air, mingling with the faint hum of conversation from the few lingering customers. Ben, a young black man in his early 20s, carried himself with quiet dignity. His coworkers often teased him for his patience, but Ben saw it as his strength. Working here wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work, and he was determined to excel at it. The lunch crowd had thinned, and for a brief moment, the cafe felt calm. Ben allowed himself a moment to glance out the window at the busy street beyond. A chill November wind sent leaves swirling in chaotic spirals. Just as he was about to turn his attention back to the counter, the sound of the door chime snapped him back to the present. Charlotte Richards swept into the cafe, her entrance commanding attention. Dressed in a sleek, cream-colored coat with fur accents and heels that clicked with authority against the tiled floor, she radiated wealth and privilege. Her designer sunglasses were perched on her perfectly coiffed blonde hair, and her diamond earrings sparkled under the warm cafe lighting. Ben offered his usual polite greeting. "Good afternoon, ma'am. How can I help you today?" Charlotte didn't bother looking at him. She made a beeline for the counter, her phone pressed to her ear. "No, I told them it needed to be delivered today. Do you understand what that means? Today, not tomorrow," she hissed into the phone, her free hand waving dismissively at Ben. Ben waited patiently for her to finish. He wasn't new to this kind of treatment. Customers like Charlotte weren't uncommon. When she finally ended the call, she turned her icy blue gaze on him, her lips pursed in visible irritation. "I'll have a triple shot oat milk latte. Extra hot, no foam," she said crisply. Her tone wasn't just commanding, it was cutting. "Of course, Mom," Ben replied evenly, tapping the order into the system. He knew better than to let her tone rattle him. He turned to prepare the drink, moving with precision and care, as he always did. As he handed over the drink, he noticed her eyes narrowing as she inspected it. Charlotte took a single sip, and her face contorted in displeasure. "This isn't hot enough," she snapped, thrusting the cup back at him. "Can't you even get something this simple right?" Ben accepted the cup without a word, his expression calm. He turned back to the espresso machine and made the drink again, ensuring it was extra hot this time. He handed it back to her with a polite smile. Charlotte took another sip, and this time her fury boiled over. "Unbelievable," she spat. Without warning, she hurled the steaming cup of coffee directly at Ben's face. The liquid splashed across his skin and uniform, soaking him in scalding heat. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The cafe fell silent as every pair of eyes turned to the scene unfolding at the counter. Ben froze. Shock and humiliation coursed through him, but he refused to let them show. His mother had taught him better than that. He reached for a towel, his movements steady and controlled, and wiped his face. Charlotte stood there, arms crossed, her expression smug. "Maybe now you'll learn to pay attention," she sneered before turning on her heel and walking out as if nothing had happened. Ben's manager, a middle-aged man named Mark, rushed over. "Ben, are you okay? Do you need to sit down?" "I'm fine," Ben replied quietly, though his hands trembled slightly as he continued to clean himself off. "I'll finish my shift." The other employees exchanged uneasy glances, but no one dared say anything. The cafe's atmosphere remained heavy with tension for the rest of the afternoon. When Ben finally clocked out and stepped into the cold evening air, he felt the weight of the day pressing down on him. The humiliation, the sting of hot coffee, and the indifference of his coworkers all churned in his mind. He replayed the incident over and over, questioning if there was something he could have done differently to prevent it. As he walked home, he thought of his mother, Dr. Cynthia Brooks. A formidable woman, Cynthia had raised him to hold his head high no matter what life threw at him. She was a corporate powerhouse, a role model who had shattered glass ceilings and defied expectations at every turn. Ben admired her more than anyone, and the last thing he wanted was to burden her with his problems. By the time he reached their modest but well-kept home, he had resolved not to tell her. He pushed open the door and was greeted by the warm, familiar scent of baked goods, his mother's stress relief after long days at the office. "Ben," Cynthia called from the kitchen. "Dinner's almost ready. How was work?" "It was fine," Ben replied, forcing a smile as he hung up his coat. He didn't miss the way his mother's sharp eyes lingered on him, her intuition telling her something was off. "You sure?" she pressed, her tone gentle but probing. "Yeah," Ben said quickly. "Just tired." Cynthia didn't push further, but her concern was evident. As they sat down to eat, Ben tried to focus on their conversation, but his mind kept drifting back to the cafe, to Charlotte, and to the silent stares of the customers who had witnessed everything yet done nothing. He didn't know it yet, but this day was the beginning of a chain of events that would change both his and Charlotte's lives forever. A mother's intuition. Ben sat at the dinner table, picking at his plate of roast chicken and vegetables. Across from him, his mother, Dr. Cynthia Brooks, studied him intently. Cynthia was a woman of quiet strength, her commanding presence honed through years of navigating corporate boardrooms where her gender and race had often made her the exception rather than the rule. Though she exuded confidence and composure in every setting, her most important role had always been as Ben's mother. "Ben," Cynthia began softly, breaking the silence. "You've been quiet tonight. Something's bothering you." Ben glanced up, his fork frozen midway to his mouth. "I'm fine, Mom. Just tired," he repeated, but the lie felt heavy on his tongue. Cynthia leaned back in her chair, her sharp eyes narrowing slightly. She knew her son too well to be fooled by his dismissive response. While Ben had inherited her resilience, he also had a tendency to internalize his struggles, a habit she both admired and worried about. She had spent years teaching him to stand tall in the face of adversity, but she also knew that strength could sometimes look like vulnerability. "Ben, I know you don't like to talk about work," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But I can see something happened today. Whatever it is, you don't have to carry it alone." Ben hesitated. He wanted to tell her, but the thought of reliving the humiliation made his stomach churn. Finally, he took a deep breath and set his fork down. "There was an incident," he began carefully. "A customer got upset and threw coffee at me." Cynthia's expression shifted in an instant. Her calm demeanor hardened into something sharper, more focused. "What do you mean they threw coffee at you? Were you hurt?" "No," Ben replied quickly, though the memory of the scalding liquid on his skin still lingered. "It wasn't hot enough to burn me, but it was humiliating." Cynthia's jaw tightened. "Who was this customer?" Ben shrugged. "Just some entitled woman. She didn't like how her drink was made, and she snapped. That's all." "That's all," Cynthia repeated, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Ben, someone assaulted you at your workplace. That's not something to brush off." Ben shook his head. "Mom, it's not worth making a big deal about. People like her, wealthy, entitled, they think they can get away with anything. And most of the time they do." Cynthia's eyes narrowed further, a flicker of anger breaking through her otherwise composed exterior. "Did anyone step in? Your manager? Other customers?" "Mark, my manager, asked if I was okay," Ben admitted, "but I told him I could handle it. The other customers just stared. No one said anything." Cynthia folded her hands on the table, her mind already working through the implications of what Ben had told her. She had spent her entire career fighting against systemic injustice and bias, and the idea that her son had been subjected to such blatant disrespect enraged her. "Ben," she said carefully, "I understand why you didn't want to escalate things, but this isn't just about you. It's about sending a message that behavior like that isn't acceptable." Ben sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know, Mom, but what can we do? She's probably some rich woman who doesn't think twice about people like me." Cynthia's lips curved into a small, determined smile. "Rich or not, No one is above accountability. Did you get her name? Ben shook his head. No, but she looked like the kind of person who doesn't blend in. Blonde, expensive clothes, designer everything. I'm sure Mark could find her name if it's in the system. Cynthia nodded, her mind racing. She didn't want to overwhelm Ben, but she also couldn't let this slide. Let me handle it, she said finally. You've already endured enough. That night, after Ben had gone to bed, Cynthia retreated to her home office. The space was a reflection of her meticulous nature. Neat stacks of papers, shelves lined with books on leadership and strategy, and a sleek laptop glowing softly on the desk. She sat down and began researching. Cynthia's network was vast, and her influence extended far beyond her corporate role. She had cultivated relationships with CEOs, politicians, and community leaders, all of whom respected her for her integrity and tenacity. If this woman who had assaulted Ben was connected to the local elite, Cynthia was confident she could find out. She started with a call to Mark, the manager at Ben's cafe. After a brief introduction and explanation, she asked, "Mark, can you tell me if this woman paid with a card? Her name would be in the system." Mark hesitated, but Cynthia's calm, authoritative tone left little room for refusal. Yeah, I can look into it. Give me a second." After a few moments, Mark returned. "Her name is Charlotte Richards." Cynthia thanked him and hung up, her fingers already typing the name into her laptop. Within minutes, she found Charlotte's social media profiles. Photos of lavish parties, exotic vacations, and charity galas painted a picture of someone who reveled in her privilege. Her husband, David Richards, was a prominent figure in the local real estate market, known for his philanthropy and business acumen. Cynthia's eyes narrowed as she studied Charlotte's profile. This wasn't just about wealth. Charlotte was deeply entrenched in the city's elite circles. Her arrogance likely stemmed from a lifetime of being surrounded by people who reinforced her sense of superiority. But Cynthia wasn't intimidated. If anything, Charlotte's high profile made her vulnerable. Cynthia knew how to navigate these social dynamics, and she wasn't afraid to leverage her own connections to hold Charlotte accountable. The next morning, Cynthia arrived at her office with a renewed sense of purpose. She had a meeting scheduled with a prominent local business association, and as luck would have it, David Richards was on the board. Cynthia couldn't have planned it better if she tried. As the meeting began, Cynthia sat quietly, observing the room. David Richards was a tall, charismatic man in his late 40s, with an air of professionalism that contrasted sharply with what she had seen of his wife online. He seemed genuinely invested in the community initiatives being discussed, which only made Cynthia's next move more strategic. When the meeting ended, Cynthia approached David with a warm smile. "David, a moment of your time." "Of course, Dr. Brooks," he said, extending a hand. "What can I do for you?" Cynthia's smile didn't waver, but her tone turned serious. "I wanted to bring something to your attention. Something involving your wife." David's expression shifted to one of mild confusion. "Charlotte, is something wrong?" Cynthia hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Yesterday, your wife was involved in an incident at a local cafe where my son works. She behaved in a way that was both inappropriate and deeply disrespectful." David frowned. "I'm sorry to hear that. What exactly happened?" Cynthia recounted the incident in measured detail, ensuring her tone remained professional despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. As she spoke, she watched David's expression darken. "I'm not here to create a scene, Mr. Richards," she concluded, "but I believe in accountability. I trust you'll address this within your household." David nodded slowly, his face a mixture of embarrassment and concern. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention, Dr. Brooks. I'll speak with Charlotte." Cynthia nodded, her expression unreadable. "I appreciate that. Let's hope this can be resolved amicably." As she walked away, Cynthia felt a sense of satisfaction. She knew she had planted a seed, but this was only the beginning. Charlotte Richards had thrown coffee at the wrong cashier, and Cynthia Brooks wasn't about to let her forget it. the catalyst for change. David Richards returned home that evening to their sprawling estate on the edge of the city. The gated property, surrounded by perfectly manicured hedges and a long, winding driveway, exuded opulence. Inside, the grand chandelier in the foyer cast a warm glow over the marble floors. Charlotte was lounging on the plush, cream-colored sofa in the living room, scrolling through her phone, completely oblivious to the storm brewing just behind her husband's composed exterior. "Charlotte," David called, setting his briefcase down on a side table. His voice was firm, with an edge that caught her attention. "What is it?" she asked, not bothering to look up from her phone. She was used to David's occasional bouts of seriousness, usually concerning business matters, but she had no reason to suspect that this time was any different. David walked into the living room and stood in front of her, his arms crossed. "We need to talk." Finally, Charlotte looked up, her expression a mix of curiosity and annoyance. "About what?" "About what happened yesterday," David said, his tone leaving no room for dismissal. "At the cafe, with that cashier." Charlotte's face immediately hardened, her defensive instincts kicking in. "Oh, that," she said with a wave of her hand. "It was nothing. The kid couldn't even make a simple coffee right." David's jaw tightened. "Charlotte, I spoke with someone today. Dr. Cynthia Brooks. She's the mother of the kid you humiliated. Do you have any idea who she is?" Charlotte frowned, her mind racing. "Why does it matter? I didn't do anything wrong. If anything, that boy should be thanking me for teaching him how to handle dissatisfied customers." David's voice rose, something that rarely happened in their marriage. "You threw coffee at him, Charlotte, in front of a room full of people. That's not dissatisfaction, that's cruelty." Charlotte blinked, stunned by the force of his words. "Cruelty? Don't be so dramatic, David. It's not like he got hurt." David shook his head in disbelief. "Do you hear yourself? You didn't just insult him. You assaulted him. And you did it because what? Your coffee wasn't hot enough. Do you even realize what kind of position you've put us in?" Charlotte crossed her arms, her indignation flaring. "Us? Don't tell me you're worried about your reputation because some cashier got his feelings hurt." David exhaled sharply, pinching the bridge of his nose. "This isn't about feelings, Charlotte. It's about accountability. Dr. Brooks is one of the most influential people in this city. She has the power to ruin us if she chooses to. And after what you did to her son, I wouldn't blame her." Charlotte's confidence faltered for a brief moment. She wouldn't do that. David's gaze bore into hers. "Wouldn't she? You clearly don't understand who you're dealing with. Dr. Brooks has built an empire on integrity and respect. The fact that she even approached me privately instead of going public says a lot about her character. But if you don't make this right, she won't hold back." For the first time, Charlotte felt a flicker of fear. She wasn't used to facing consequences. Her wealth and connections had always insulated her from the fallout of her actions. But David's words carried a weight she couldn't ignore. "What do you expect me to do?" she asked, her voice quieter now. David stared at her for a long moment before answering. "Apologize. Not just to him, but to his mother. And you need to mean it." Charlotte opened her mouth to protest, but the look in David's eyes stopped her. This wasn't a suggestion. It was a demand. She knew better than to push him when he was this serious. The next morning, Charlotte found herself sitting in her sleek black SUV, parked outside the cafe where the incident had occurred. She clutched her designer handbag tightly, her heart pounding with a mixture of anger and unease. She didn't want to be here. The very thought of humbling herself in front of a cashier was almost unbearable. But David's words from the night before echoed in her mind. If you don't make this right, she won't hold back. With a deep breath, Charlotte stepped out of the car and walked into the cafe. The bell above the door chimed softly, and the familiar aroma of coffee and baked goods filled the air. The sight of Ben behind the counter, wiping down the espresso machine, brought back the memory of her tantrum. She felt a twinge of guilt but quickly buried it beneath her practiced composure. Ben looked up as she approached, his expression a mixture of surprise and caution. He recognized her immediately, though he made no attempt to acknowledge it. "Hi," Charlotte began, her voice unusually tentative. "I need to speak with you." Ben raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, waiting for her to continue. I want to apologize," she said, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. "For what happened the other day. I acted poorly." Ben stared at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Charlotte wondered if he was going to accept her apology or simply walk away. "I appreciate the apology," Ben said finally, his tone measured. "But words don't erase what you did." Charlotte's jaw tightened. She wasn't used to being spoken to so directly, especially not by someone she considered beneath her. But there was no mistaking the quiet strength in Ben's voice, a strength that unnerved her. "I understand," she said after a pause. "Is there anything I can do to make it right?" Ben studied her for a moment before replying. "Respect people, not just me, but everyone, because next time, you might not get the chance to apologize." His words hit harder than Charlotte expected. She nodded stiffly and turned to leave, feeling a strange mix of relief and discomfort. As Charlotte drove away from the cafe, she couldn't shake the encounter from her mind. For the first time in years, someone had spoken to her without fear or deference. It was unsettling, but it also planted a seed of self-reflection she hadn't anticipated. Meanwhile, back at the cafe, Ben felt a small measure of satisfaction. He hadn't wanted an apology, but seeing Charlotte forced to confront her actions gave him a sense of justice. Little did he know, the ripple effects of this confrontation were just beginning, and they would change all their lives in ways none of them could have predicted. A ripple effect. Charlotte Richards returned home, her mind a chaotic swirl of emotions. The encounter with Ben had left her shaken in a way she hadn't anticipated. She prided herself on her control, her ability to dictate the tone and direction of every interaction. But Ben's quiet dignity had thrown her off balance. His words, simple yet pointed, replayed in her mind. "Respect people, not just me, but everyone." She poured herself a glass of wine and sank into the oversized leather armchair in the living room. For the first time in years, she felt small, not because someone had belittled her, but because she had seen herself clearly through someone else's eyes. Charlotte wasn't used to self-reflection. It was an uncomfortable space she had avoided all her life. But now, faced with the undeniable truth of her behavior, she couldn't escape it. Meanwhile, at the Brooks household, Ben recounted the day's events to his mother. Cynthia listened intently as Ben described Charlotte's apology, her rigid demeanor, and the awkward sincerity of her attempt to make amends. "She apologized?" Cynthia asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah," Ben replied. "I didn't expect it, but she did. I told her to respect people, and then she left." Cynthia nodded thoughtfully. "Good. She needed to hear that." Ben leaned back in his chair, his expression contemplative. "Do you think people like her can change? Or was this just about saving face because of who you are?" Cynthia considered the question carefully. "Change is hard, especially for people who've never been challenged before. But sometimes, all it takes is one moment, one confrontation with the truth, to start the process. Whether she changes or not isn't your responsibility. You did what you could, and that's enough." Ben nodded, though a part of him still felt uneasy. He wasn't sure why the incident continued to linger in his thoughts. It wasn't the first time he had faced discrimination or disrespect, but something about this particular confrontation felt different. It felt unfinished. Over the next week, the ripple effects of the incident began to spread. Unbeknownst to Ben, word of Charlotte's behavior had reached the ears of her social circle. David, who was deeply embarrassed by the incident, had confided in a close friend at a charity gala. From there, the story had taken on a life of its own, whispered in hushed tones at cocktail parties and luncheons. "Did you hear about Charlotte Richards?" One woman murmured to her companion at a boutique opening. Apparently, she threw coffee at a barista. No, the other woman gasped, her perfectly manicured hand flying to her mouth. Why would she do something like that? Who knows? But her husband is furious. He's been trying to keep it quiet, but you know how these things get out. The story spread like wildfire, and soon, Charlotte found herself the subject of scrutiny and judgment from the very people she considered her peers. Invitations to exclusive events became fewer, and conversations with acquaintances turned awkward. Charlotte had always believed that her wealth and status insulated her from consequences, but now she was beginning to realize that even privilege had its limits. At the same time, Dr. Cynthia Brooks was making quiet moves of her own. Though she hadn't publicly called out Charlotte, she had used her influence to ensure the incident wouldn't be forgotten. She brought it up subtly in conversations with key figures in the business community, framing it as a broader discussion about respect and accountability. It's not just about this one incident, Cynthia said during a board meeting at her company. It's about creating a culture where everyone is treated with dignity, regardless of their position. If we let behavior like this go unchecked, it sets a dangerous precedent. Her words carried weight, and soon her message began to resonate beyond the walls of her office. Local business leaders started implementing new training programs focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Cynthia's quiet but deliberate actions were sparking meaningful change, even as Charlotte remained oblivious to the larger impact of her actions. One evening, as Charlotte sat alone in her study, she received a call from her oldest friend, Evelyn. Evelyn was one of the few people who could speak candidly with Charlotte without fear of reprisal. "Charlotte," Evelyn began, her tone sharp, "I've been hearing things about the cafe incident." Charlotte sighed, leaning back in her chair. "I know. Everyone's talking about it." "Well, maybe they should," Evelyn replied. "What were you thinking? Do you realize how bad this makes you look?" Charlotte's grip on the phone tightened. It was a moment of frustration. "I apologized. What else do people want from me?" Evelyn's voice softened slightly. "People want to see that you've learned something. Apologizing is a start, but it doesn't erase the damage. You've built your life on privilege, Charlotte. Maybe it's time you started using that privilege to lift others up instead of tearing them down." Charlotte was silent for a long moment. Evelyn's words stung, but deep down, she knew they were true. "How do I even begin to fix this?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Start by listening," Evelyn said simply. "Listen to the people you've ignored, the people you've dismissed. Let their stories change you." In the days that followed, Charlotte found herself reflecting more deeply on her life and the choices that had led her to this point. She began reading about systemic inequality and privilege, topics she had previously dismissed as irrelevant to her. For the first time, she began to see the world through a lens that wasn't tinted by her own biases. Her transformation was slow and uncomfortable, but it was genuine. She reached out to organizations that supported underprivileged communities and offered her resources and time. She began attending workshops on racial equity and implicit bias, not just as a way to repair her reputation, but as a way to better understand the harm she had caused. For Ben, life at the cafe returned to normal, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. When Charlotte walked in one afternoon, he braced himself for another confrontation, but what happened next surprised him. "I've been volunteering," she said quietly, standing across the counter from him, "at a shelter downtown. I'm learning a lot." Ben studied her, unsure of what to say. Finally, he nodded. "Good." Charlotte hesitated, then added, "I know it doesn't make up for what I did, but I'm trying." Ben's expression softened slightly. "It's a start." As Charlotte left the cafe, Ben felt a small spark of hope. People could change, he realized. It just took the right catalyst. Little did they both know, the ripples of their encounter were far from over. What had started as a moment of cruelty and humiliation was slowly transforming into a story of redemption, growth and the unexpected power of accountability. The unfolding consequences. As Charlotte exited the cafe, a heavy mix of emotions churned within her: relief that she'd finally faced Ben again, shame for what she had done, and uncertainty about the path she was now on. For the first time in her life, Charlotte was actively questioning her sense of entitlement, her view of the world, and her place within it. The process was uncomfortable and unfamiliar, but she couldn't ignore the nagging realization that she had lived in a bubble of privilege for far too long. That evening, Charlotte sat alone in her bedroom, scrolling through her phone. Her social media accounts, once filled with glowing comments and likes on photos of luxury vacations and high-end fashion, now featured sharp criticisms. Though she had made her profile private after the incident began circulating, screenshots of her behavior had found their way into local online forums. One post caught her attention. It featured an anonymous recounting of the cafe incident, likely from a bystander who had witnessed the entire event. People like her think they're untouchable. She threw coffee at a hardworking cashier, as if he wasn't even human. It's disgusting to see this kind of behavior in 2024. We should hold people like this accountable, no matter how much money they have. The comments below were a mixture of outrage and calls for action. Some suggested boycotting her husband's real estate company, while others expressed sympathy for Ben and his family. For the first time, Charlotte saw herself through the eyes of the public, not as a powerful, admired socialite, but as someone who had used her privilege to demean another person. The realization hit her harder than she expected. Charlotte wasn't used to feeling vulnerable, but now she felt exposed in a way that no amount of wealth or status could shield her from. She decided to call Evelyn again. "Evelyn, I need your help," she said the moment her friend answered. Evelyn's voice was warm but firm. "I was hoping you'd say that. What do you need?" Charlotte hesitated. "I don't know where to start. I've been reading, volunteering, even trying to apologize. But it doesn't feel like enough. I don't want this to be performative. I want to change." Evelyn paused before responding. "That's a good first step, Charlotte. But real change takes time. You need to be willing to listen, to learn, and to sit with the discomfort of acknowledging your privilege. And you need to be consistent. People will only believe you're sincere if they see it in your actions, not just your words." Charlotte nodded, even though Evelyn couldn't see her. "You're right. Can you connect me with someone who can guide me through this? Someone who understands the work that needs to be done?" Evelyn smiled on the other end of the line. "I think I know just the person." The following week, Charlotte attended her first community workshop on racial equity and systemic injustice. It was held in a modest community center on the other side of town, a world away from the opulence she was used to. The room was filled with a diverse group of people, some community leaders, others simply locals who wanted to make a difference. At first, Charlotte felt out of place. Her designer coat and expensive handbag stood out starkly against the casual attire of the other attendees. The workshop began with a discussion on privilege and its role in perpetuating inequality. Charlotte listened as people shared their experiences, stories of discrimination, of being overlooked or dismissed, of fighting for opportunities that had always come easily to her. As she listened, she began to see patterns she had previously ignored, both in the world around her and in her own behavior. When it was her turn to speak, Charlotte hesitated. The room was silent as everyone turned their attention to her. I'm not sure what to say," she admitted. "I've lived my whole life in a world where I didn't have to think about these things. I thought my privilege was normal, and I didn't see how it affected others. But now I realize that's part of the problem. I don't expect anyone here to forgive me or even believe me when I say I want to change, but I'm here because I need to learn." A middle-aged woman in the front row nodded. "Acknowledging that is a start," she said. "The real work comes next." While Charlotte was beginning her journey of self-reflection and growth, Cynthia Brooks was wrapping up a meeting with the local Chamber of Commerce. The topic of discussion had been a new initiative aimed at promoting diversity and inclusion in local businesses, a project that Cynthia had been championing for months. As the meeting ended, one of the board members approached her. "Dr. Brooks, I wanted to commend you on how you handled the situation with the Richards family. It's not easy to confront people like that, but you did it with grace." Cynthia offered a polite smile. "Thank you, but this was never about the Richards family specifically. It's about holding everyone to the same standard, regardless of their status." The board member nodded. "Still, it's making waves. People are talking, and it's opening up conversations we should have had a long time ago." Cynthia felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The incident at the cafe, though painful for Ben, had sparked something larger, a shift in how the community was addressing issues of inequality and privilege. But for Cynthia, this was just the beginning. She knew there was still much work to be done. As the days turned into weeks, the ripple effects of the cafe incident continued to unfold. Ben, now a reluctant symbol of resilience in the face of injustice, found himself receiving words of encouragement from customers and coworkers alike. While he appreciated the support, he remained humble, focusing on doing his job with the same quiet dignity he always had. One evening, as Ben was closing up the cafe, Charlotte walked in again. This time, she wasn't wearing her usual designer clothes. Her outfit was simple, her demeanor uncharacteristically subdued. "I wanted to thank you," she said softly, standing across the counter from him, "for what you said to me. It's changed the way I see things." Ben looked at her, surprised. "You're welcome," he said after a pause. "But I didn't say much." "Sometimes," Charlotte replied, "the simplest truths are the ones that hit the hardest." Ben nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I'm glad it made a difference." As Charlotte left the cafe, Ben couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. The incident that had once filled him with anger and humiliation had become a catalyst for change, not just for Charlotte, but for himself, his mother, and the community around them. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. And sometimes, a start is all you need to begin rewriting the narrative. Rebuilding bridges. Weeks passed, and life in the city began to settle into a new rhythm. The cafe where Ben worked became more than just a place to grab coffee. It became a quiet epicenter for conversations about respect, accountability, and change. Regular customers who had witnessed the incident would occasionally mention it to Ben, not out of pity, but admiration for the way he had handled himself. For Ben, the incident with Charlotte was no longer an open wound but a scar, a reminder of the resilience his mother had instilled in him. He had never sought attention or sympathy, but the support he received gave him a sense of validation that he hadn't expected. People were listening now. People were watching. Charlotte Richards, on the other hand, was in the middle of a personal transformation. The workshops, the volunteering, and the conversations she was now having with people she'd once dismissed had begun to reshape her worldview. For the first time, she started to understand that privilege wasn't just about money or status. It was about access, opportunity, and the ability to walk through life without fear of being judged or mistreated. But understanding wasn't enough. Charlotte knew she had to do more, especially for Ben, whose dignity and courage had been the catalyst for her awakening. She began brainstorming ways to make a tangible impact, ways to show that her apology wasn't just words. That was when an idea struck her, something that could benefit not only Ben but others like him. At her next workshop, Charlotte stayed late to speak with the facilitator, a community leader named Marcus, who had been instrumental in guiding her journey. "Marcus," Charlotte began hesitantly, "I've been thinking about how I can contribute. I don't just want to donate money and move on. I want to create something lasting." Marcus raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you have in mind?" Charlotte took a deep breath. "I was thinking about starting a fund, something that provides scholarships or training programs for young people from underrepresented communities, people like Ben. He works so hard, and he's clearly capable of so much more than people give him credit for. I want to help create opportunities for people like him to succeed." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "It's a good idea," Charlotte. "But if you're serious about this, you'll need to be involved, not just financially, but personally. People will only trust this initiative if they see that you're committed." Charlotte straightened her shoulders. "I am." A few weeks later, Charlotte visited the cafe again. This time, she wasn't alone. Marcus accompanied her, carrying a folder filled with documents detailing the new initiative they had been working on, the Path Forward Fund. It was designed to provide scholarships, mentorship programs, and professional development opportunities for underprivileged youth in the city. Ben was wiping down the counter when Charlotte and Marcus entered. He glanced up, his expression neutral. While Charlotte had apologized and shown genuine efforts to change, Ben remained cautious. Words were easy. Action was harder. "Hi, Ben," Charlotte said, her voice softer than he remembered. "Do you have a minute to talk?" Ben set down the cloth and crossed his arms. "Sure." Charlotte motioned to Marcus. "This is Marcus, a community leader I've been working with. We've been putting together a program, and I'd like to share it with you." Ben raised an eyebrow, but gestured for them to continue. Marcus stepped forward and placed the folder on the counter. "Ben, this is something Charlotte and I have been working on, a fund designed to help people like you. It's not just about money. It's about mentorship, training, and creating opportunities for young people to thrive in industries where they're often overlooked." Ben glanced down at the folder, flipping through the pages. He saw details about scholarships, partnerships with local businesses, and plans for mentorship programs. It was impressive, but he remained skeptical. "Why me?" Ben asked, looking directly at Charlotte. Charlotte hesitated before answering. "Because I owe you more than an apology. You didn't just handle my behavior with grace. You showed me who I was, and who I could be. This isn't just about making amends. It's about honoring the strength and dignity you showed me that day. You inspired this, Ben." Ben studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded. "It's a good idea. But if you're serious about this, it has to be for the right reasons, not just because you feel guilty." Charlotte nodded, her eyes sincere. "It is, and I'm committed to making it work." Over the following months, the Path Forward Fund began to take shape. Charlotte leveraged her connections in the business world to secure partnerships and funding, while Marcus brought in community leaders to ensure the program stayed grounded in its mission. Together, they organized workshops, job fairs, and networking events designed to empower underprivileged youth. Ben, despite his initial reservations, found himself drawn to the program. Marcus invited him to speak at one of the workshops, sharing his story with other young people who faced similar challenges. Though he was nervous at first, Ben's story resonated deeply with the audience. "When someone threw coffee at me because they thought I wasn't worth their time, I felt humiliated," Ben said, standing before a packed room. "But what I learned from that experience is that your worth isn't defined by how others treat you. It's defined by how you choose to respond." The room erupted in applause, and for the first time, Ben felt the full impact of his resilience. His voice mattered, and it was making a difference. For Cynthia Brooks, watching her son step into a leadership role was a moment of immense pride. She attended the workshop where Ben spoke, standing quietly at the back of the room as he captivated the audience. Afterward, she approached him, her eyes shining with emotion. "You were incredible," she said, pulling him into a hug. Ben smiled. "Thanks, Mom. I guess I learned from the best." Cynthia chuckled softly. "You've always had it in you, Ben. I'm just glad the world is finally seeing what I've known all along." As the months turned into a year, the ripple effects of the Path Forward Fund began to spread. Young people who had been overlooked were now thriving in their careers, thanks to the opportunities the program provided. Charlotte, once the epitome of privilege and entitlement, had transformed into a genuine advocate for change. And Ben, who had once felt powerless in the face of injustice, had become a symbol of resilience and hope. The cafe incident that had once seemed like a moment of humiliation had become the catalyst for something far greater. It was a reminder that even the smallest actions, whether cruel or kind, could have far-reaching consequences. And for everyone involved, it was a lesson in the power of accountability, growth, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. A legacy of change. 1 year after the cafe incident, life for all involved had transformed in ways none of them could have imagined. What had begun as an act of cruelty had blossomed into a community movement that was reshaping lives, breaking barriers, and fostering understanding. But the story was far from over. It was evolving. Ben's new beginning. Ben stood at the podium of a grand auditorium, the sound of applause filling the space as he adjusted the microphone. The room was packed with students, professionals, and community leaders attending the inaugural summit of the Path Forward Fund. The event marked a major milestone. The fund had not only reached its first-year goals but surpassed them. Scholarships had been awarded, mentorship programs had flourished, and dozens of young people from underserved communities were now on the path to success. Ben cleared his throat, his voice steady as he began. "A year ago, I was standing behind the counter of a cafe, doing my best to make ends meet. I never imagined that an ordinary day at work would change my life, or that I'd be standing here today. But life has a way of surprising you." He paused, scanning the audience. Among the faces, he spotted his mother, Cynthia, sitting in the front row with a proud smile. Next to her was Marcus, nodding in encouragement, and even Charlotte, who sat quietly, her presence a stark reminder of how much had changed. Ben continued, his voice growing stronger. "What happened to me wasn't just about a moment of disrespect. It was about the deeper issues we face as a society: inequality, prejudice, and the way we treat each other. But instead of letting that moment define me, I chose to rise above it. And thanks to the support of my family, my community, and programs like this one, I found a way to turn pain into purpose." The crowd erupted in applause, and for the first time, Ben felt truly at peace with what had happened. He had taken something ugly and turned it into something beautiful, a legacy that would outlast him. Charlotte's redemption. Sitting in the audience, Charlotte listened to Ben's speech with a mix of pride and humility. Over the past year, she had worked tirelessly to ensure the Path Forward Fund wasn't just a fleeting gesture but a lasting initiative. She had thrown herself into the work, attending every meeting, personally mentoring students, and using her connections to secure funding and partnerships. For the first time in her life, she felt like her wealth and privilege were being used for something meaningful. After the event, Charlotte approached Ben, her steps cautious but confident. "That was a beautiful speech," she said, her voice sincere. Ben nodded. "Thank you. And thank you for being here." Charlotte hesitated. "I still think about that day at the cafe. I'll never forget what I did, and I'll never stop trying to make it right." Ben studied her for a moment before replying. "You've already done a lot. What matters now is what you keep doing." Charlotte smiled softly. "I plan to." Cynthia's influence. For Dr. Cynthia Brooks, the past year had been a testament to the power of resilience and advocacy. Watching Ben grow into a leader had been her greatest joy, but she wasn't content to rest on the sidelines. Inspired by her son's journey and the impact of the Path Forward Fund, Cynthia had launched her own initiative within her corporate sphere, Project Rise. Focused on creating pathways for underrepresented talent in the corporate world, Project Rise had already secured internships, mentorships, and full-time positions for dozens of young professionals. At the summit, she gave her own speech, sharing her vision for a more equitable future. "Diversity isn't just a buzzword," Cynthia said to the crowd. "It's a necessity. When we include voices from all walks of life, we create stronger organizations, stronger communities, and a stronger world. And it starts with each of us making the choice to lift others as we climb." Her words were met with a standing ovation. As Cynthia stepped off the stage, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had spent her life breaking barriers, but now she was building bridges for others to cross. The community's growth. The impact of the Path Forward Fund extended far beyond Ben and Charlotte. The community as a whole began to feel the effects of the movement it had sparked. Local businesses started implementing diversity and inclusion initiatives. Schools partnered with the fund to provide resources for students, and conversations about privilege and respect became more common. One of the most striking changes was the transformation of the cafe where it all began. The owner, inspired by the fund's mission, had implemented new policies to ensure all employees were treated with respect and fairness. He even partnered with the Path Forward Fund to offer internships and job training programs for young people in the neighborhood. The ripple effect. As the program grew, its influence began to spread to neighboring cities. News outlets picked up the story, framing it as a powerful example of how one moment of accountability could spark widespread change. Charlotte, once vilified for her actions, became a reluctant but genuine spokesperson for the fund. Her transformation resonated with audiences, showing that even those who had been part of the problem could become part of the solution. In interviews, Charlotte often deflected attention from herself, redirecting the spotlight to the fund's beneficiaries. "This isn't about me," she would say. "It's about the incredible young people who are seizing these opportunities and building a better future." A quiet evening. One evening after a particularly long day, Ben and Cynthia sat together on their porch, the warm glow of the setting sun casting a golden light over the neighborhood. Ben held a cup of tea, while Cynthia sipped on her favorite herbal blend. "You've come a long way," Cynthia said, her voice full of pride. "From that young man wiping down counters to the one standing on that stage today." Ben chuckled. "I guess I've had some pretty great role models." Cynthia smiled, her eyes glistening. "I couldn't be prouder of you, Ben. But remember, this is just the beginning. There's so much more you can do." Ben nodded, gazing out at the horizon. "I know, and I'm ready for it." A legacy secured. As the sun dipped below the skyline, the legacy of what had started as a single moment of cruelty continued to grow. It was a story of redemption, resilience, and the enduring power of change. Ben, Cynthia, Charlotte, and countless others had turned pain into purpose, proving that even the darkest moments could lead to the brightest futures. The path forward wasn't always easy, but it was clear. And for everyone who had been touched by this journey, it was a reminder that change, no matter how small, always starts with a single step.